Thanks, Diego, for the invitation to present something for your class on preparing for the worst case scenario. So this is a really quick snapshot on what I believe is a really important topic for people working with athletes. We shouldn't be looking to train for the average demands of competition. We should be trying to identify what the most demanding passages of play are and make sure that our athletes are prepared for that. So if we look at the demands of the game, there's a lot of different ways that we can quantify the demands of competition. Now this figure shows the meters per minute, which is one measure of intensity that we can use to measure the intensity of a whole heap of different types of team sport competition. And you can see that right up the top, Australian football matches are very intense. Depending on the competition, they may cover 140 metres per minute. In soccer, players will cover somewhere around 100 to 110 metres per minute. And in a sport like rugby union, the demands are around 70 to 80 metres per minute. Now, you could look at that on its own and say, well, players are just covering metres per minute, and you could say that AFL, Australian football, is much more demanding than, say, soccer or rugby union. But what metres per minute fails to take into account is what occurs inside those metres per minute. And what we talk about there is the most demanding passages of play, the worst case scenario. And I'll give you an example. In rugby union, where you're required to make multiple collisions, they're physically really demanding events, and they could occur in a very short space that doesn't require you to cover a lot of ground. So you're not actually running a lot, but you're performing a lot of work. The GPS in that example will say that you've essentially done no work at all because you've done no movement. But if you've ever had to make a tackle and a collision and wrestling and grappling, it's physically really demanding work. So this presentation takes into account some of the physical activities that our game demands that isn't captured by just running alone. Now, if we look at the Premier League, the other thing I'd like to really highlight in this presentation is that across any sport, and I use the Premier League as an example, but across any sport, you can see that over time, the physical demands of competition are increasing. Our sports are getting harder and harder. They're not getting any easier. So managing our athletes away from training, trying to stop them from performing these most demanding passages of play are probably not going to be the ideal way to prepare our athletes for these increasing demands. If the game's getting harder, then we need to improve our training to make sure our athletes are prepared for that. When we're putting training programs together, there's three concepts that I like people to keep in mind. I like my coaches to keep in mind. The first is to identify the demands of the sport. And what I'm talking about there is, what are we actually training for? The second thing I like our coaches to think about is, what are the physical qualities that our athletes are required in order to do their job? And the third thing I like my coaches to keep in mind is an individual needs analysis. And basically what this highlights is that each athlete within your team is going to require slightly different physical qualities in order to do their job properly. So it's all about identifying the factors that are limiting their performance on an individual basis. Once you can do that, once you can identify those factors, you can work on those qualities to improve those physical qualities, which then feeds back on the athlete's ability to perform the demands of the game or to do their job better. So let's talk about worst case scenario as it applies to a sport like field hockey. Now, field hockey is a pretty popular sport in Argentina, so I chose this one for a reason, because you tend to be pretty good at it. But we could easily apply this to soccer. We could apply it to rugby union. There's a whole heap of different sports, tennis, for example, that have most demanding passages of play. They have average demands, and then they have the worst case scenario. Now, this is an example of repeated sprinting that occurs from field hockey. Now, it's a study that was done way back in 2004 on international field hockey players. And the purpose of the study was to find out how many repeated sprint bouts occurred in international field hockey. And they defined a repeated sprint bout as 3 or more sprints with less than 21 seconds recovery between sprints. What they found was that in general, repeated sprinting didn't happen very often in international field hockey. And on average, there were 2 repeated sprint bouts per player per game. So you can say across in those days, a 70-minute game, there wasn't a lot of repeated sprinting that occurred. But what tended to happen is those repeated sprint bouts tended to occur at critical periods of the game, when there were shots on goal or when there were shots scored or shots conceded. So the ability or the inability to perform repeated sprint bouts could prove critical to the outcome of the game. Now, for a long time, we've just assumed that the ability to perform these most demanding passages of play are dependent on the strength and conditioning coach. The strength and conditioning coach is there to prepare the players physically, so it's part of their role. But in reality, we all have a role in helping players prepare for the worst case scenario. So this is a timeline of an example of something as simple as high speed running that occurs in soccer, it occurs in rugby, it occurs in field hockey. And I've shown high speed running relative to the different training and match activities that occur across any sport. Now, you can see that in off-season break, not much high-speed running occurs. Some athletes will train, some will go on holidays. When we have our athletes in skill sessions, for example, you can see that in general, the high-speed running demands of skills is well below the red line of the average demands of competition. So skill coaches can play a role in helping prepare athletes for those demands of competition just by increasing the intensity of their skill activities. Now let's look at rehabilitation. Now if we're a physiotherapist and we have an athlete in early stage rehab, let's say for example they've had a hamstring injury and they haven't been able to perform a lot of high speed running in those early periods of rehabilitation. It's really important that we give that athlete and that tissue time to heal. We can't cheat biological healing time. We can't really rush it. It is what it is. But it's really important that we keep one eye on what we're getting that athlete back for, because you can see that the high-speed running demands in early stage rehab are a long way away from the average demands of match play. And if we look a little further, they're miles away from the most intense passages of play, the worst case scenario. Now, it's important that we have a good feel for what those worst case scenarios actually are, because it doesn't matter if we're keeping them healthy in rehab. We actually have to bring them back to what they have to do in their competition. And we have to prepare them for those worst case scenarios. So what we do in rehab can really set them up for how the strength and conditioning coach trains them for those worst case scenarios. Now, from a rehab point of view, it's really important that we look forward. We look forward to what are we sending this athlete back to? What are we preparing them for? From a strength and conditioning point of view, we should be thinking, where has that athlete come from? We should be looking back and saying, has the athlete come from early stage rehab? Yes, it's important to prepare them for the worst case scenario, but we might have to do it in steps. So the important thing here is that every person in the team has a role in preparing players for the worst case scenario, the most demanding passage of play. Physiotherapists should be looking forward, and strength and conditioning coaches should be looking back. Now, as an example of a worst case scenario from rugby league, this is a really good example. It's an Australian sport, but you won't have to think too hard for how it applies to all of the sports in Argentina. If we look across the average demands of an 80-minute rugby league game, the average work to rest ratio is 1 to 5. Now, another way of saying that is for every 4 seconds of high intensity work, players have on average 20 seconds of lower intensity activity or lower intensity recovery. But that's on average. You and I both know that the game is very sporadic. it is very intermittent in nature, and those high intensity bursts are very random in the way that they come. Now, in this example, what we're talking about is not an average work to rest ratio of 1 to 5. We're talking about a work to rest ratio of 3 to 1, where there's 3 parts work, 1 part rest. And this is the true worst case scenario for rugby league, the true most demanding passages of play. Now, the take-home point here is that if our athletes train for the average demands, if they just train using a work-to-rest ratio of 1 to 5, then it's highly likely that they're going to be underprepared for the most demanding passages of play. So what we used to think about these worst-case scenarios is that it involved repeated sprinting. But if you look at the number of repeated sprint bouts that occur in rugby league, and that's the middle column of this table, on average, players only do 1 repeated sprint bout in a game. But if we look at the true worst case scenario, the ones that involve sprinting and contact, you can see that players are involved in up to 9 repeated effort bouts in a game. Now, these are not just sprinting bouts, they're sprinting plus contact plus wrestling and tackling, separated by very short recovery periods. Now, again, the take-home point here is that if we just use repeated sprinting and think that we're training our players for the worst case scenario, chances are we're going to have our players underprepared for that most demanding repeated effort demands of competition. So what does a repeated effort bout look like for rugby league? Now, I'll show you number 13 here, who's on the left-hand side. And it's a 40-second clip, but you can see what these worst-case scenarios look like in the example of rugby league. So number 13 is about to make a legs tackle there. He's just made his first legs contact. He's at second marker and he chases hard to the right. That's him chasing now. So he's just made his 3rd contact effort in a row. Now he's made a high speed effort followed by another contact effort. So in that very short passage of play, we've got a player who's made 5 contact efforts, a number of short, sharp accelerations and decelerations, 1 longer high-speed effort. And the take-home point here is that your ability to perform these repeated efforts could prove critical to the outcome of the game. As one final point that I'd like to highlight to you is that every time we train our athletes physically, we're also training the brain to go to places that it hasn't been before. Or if it has to go there in competition, that we've been there before, we've learned how to cope with this and to win this in training. And there's a good quote that comes from one of Tim Noakes's papers, and he says that exposing the brain to hard physical work on a regular basis improves the body's ability to cope with fatigue. If athletes have not been exposed to hard physical work on a regular basis, the brain instructs the body to stop exercise earlier to prevent exhaustion. So in other words, my simple take on this is that hard physical training and mentally and age-appropriate training helps to create a type of mental toughness. But before we can even put our players into a situation where they're likely to win games on a regular basis, we need to show them how to win the session on a regular basis. And we do this through regular exposure to hard physical training. We develop physically hard training programs, and then we recover on the back of that before we go back and do it again. The more often that we can expose our players to these worst case scenarios with adequate rest and within our periodization plan, the more likely it is that they'll be able to tolerate it and thrive in it when they need to do it in competition. So I'm going to leave that there. Thanks again for the opportunity to present to you this very small part of the most demanding passages of play. If you'd like to know more about this, please feel free to contact us at gabbettperformance.com.